Well, hello, friends. Today I am joined by Demetra George to talk about a fun topic that was brought up by one of our students in our training program. And a student recently asked, how did the planets come to be named so appropriately? As we're studying the planets, we find that a lot of the names, and especially with the Greco-Roman myths, make a lot of sense in terms of the archetypal dynamics and what we understand about the planets. And I thought, who better to ask this question than Demetra, because she knows all the ins and outs of the history and can kind of speak to this question over time. So thanks for joining me today, Demetra.
Tony, it's always fun to talk about these topics.
Absolutely. So can you lead us into this? Like, how did Saturn get its name, and why does it make so much sense with what we know about Saturn in myth?
Well, the short and easy answer is that the names for the planets that we have now came from the Babylonian names. And I'll speak just a little bit about that transmission. But the gnarlier question is, how did the Babylonians name the planets to begin with in ways that seem to be so appropriate to their significations? And that question is, there's no simple or obvious answer. So let's just start there. And the beginnings of Western astrology, as far as we have any written documentation, come from the area that was Babylonia, Sumeria, present-day Iraq. And there we have documented history of planetary observation, and writing had been invented around 2500 BC on clay tablets. And we have the beginnings of those correlations happening. And the Mesopotamian, and I'll use that word for Sumeria, Babylonia, Assyria, all the different cultures that did astrology for 2,000 years in that land. They believed that the divine was immanent in many forms of nature, one of which was the planets, and that the planets were one of the manifestations of their gods and goddesses. And when a planet would make an appearance in the sky, like when it rose or when it was culminating and shining brightly, or when it made heliacal risings, they thought that the god was making an appearance in the sky, telling them, listen up, like I have something to say to you. And so the Sumerians had named the planets after the various gods of their pantheon. So the planet that we know today as Venus was named Inanna by the Sumerians, who were then later conquered by the Babylonians, who named it Ishtar. And on the text, this is how, when they're talking about that planet, they use the word Ishtar or Inanna. And there's a line from about 1700 BCE that when Ishtar / Venus stands on high, meaning it's reached its highest culmination in the evening sky, lovemaking on the land. And when Venus was an evening star, she was considered to be their goddess of love and fertility. So when she's like shining her brightest, it's sort of saying to the population, hey, like, listen up. Now's the time to get sweet with your sweetie. So there was already this association between love and relationship and intimacy with that planet that we've later come to know as Venus, that was written down, and we have a documentation. How did they know that? Okay. That becomes less clear. And what brings us even like closer to the mystery, we don't really have any idea, is that even before writing was invented, and this pushes us back to about 3000 BC, when we have art from these cultures in this place, the goddess Inanna, Ishtar, is always represented pictorially by either the 8-pointed star or the 5-pointed star. And many astrologers today know that these are major numbers in Venus's cycle, that every 8 years she has a synodic return to the sun. And that's her minor years in Hellenistic time lords. And during that 8-year period, she makes 5 retrograde stations, equally distanced, which make the 5-pointed star. And so before writing happened, one can surmise that they had already determined the cycle of Venus as related to their goddess of love. So that's as far back as I can take that particular mystery, because we don't have any writing, and so we don't know exactly how that happened. But we also see, another set of inscriptions relative to Mars. And Mars was their god, Nergal, and he was a god of war, of the underworld, of pestilence and plagues. And there's a line that says, the fox is breaking into the house. And when Nergal / Mars is in the scorpion, then this land there's going to be a breach in the defenses of the city by an enemy from a certain direction. So they already knew that their god of war was connected in terms of their, omens of the intentions of the gods with an imminent invasion. So they had the 7 visible planets, and the names that those planets had were associated with the qualities that we connect with those planets. So the planet that we know is Mercury, they knew as Nebu, who was the god of the scribes. And because writing had just been invented, there was a god who oversaw that. And so that's an obvious connection. And Marduk, which is like equivalent to the planet Jupiter, was the leader of the Supreme Council of the planetary gods. And he battled a dragon, Tiamat, in the same way that later Zeus, Jupiter, in the Greek mythology battled a dragon, the Typhon, in order to establish his reign. So we have those similarities. Okay, so the Babylonians had recognized the 7 visible planets. They named them after their gods. And in their texts, there's evidence that the name of the god correlated to the kinds of events that they were recording in their texts. Okay. Now, question number 2, well, how did it get to the Greeks? And the Babylonians had been doing their astrology for 2,000 years, whereas the Greeks had not. They knew a couple of stars. They maybe knew about Mercury and Venus, although they didn't realize that they were morning and evening stars. They thought maybe they were different planets. Greece had a mountainous terrain. It had winters were foggy and rainy. They didn't have the same sort of big sky that the Babylonians do. But once Alexander the Great, on the 3rd century BCE, 4th century, conquered the lands of the Mesopotamians, and then his generals took over ruling them, the Greeks began to colonize this area, and Babylonians started traveling to Greece, and there was a exchange of information and culture and learning. And it was at that point that the Babylonian astrology and astronomy began to permeate into classical Greek culture. And the earliest mention of all 7 names of the planets in Greek texts that I've been able to locate, and I spent like years looking at stuff, and they come out of a book that is part of Plato's works called the Epinomis, but many scholars believe was written by one of his students called Philip of Opus. And in that was around late 300 BCE. And when the Greeks got the Babylonian knowledge, especially regarding the planets, their identification, means by which to locate them in the sky, they tried to give the planet the name of the Greek god that most closely resembled the qualities of its Babylonian namesake. So when we had Inanna, the goddess of love, the Greeks said, oh yeah, we have one of those. Her name is Aphrodite, okay, which then to the Romans became Venus. And when they looked at the planet Mercury, who is the scribe god of writing, they said, oh, we have a messenger of communication, right, that carries messages back and forth and is involved in education. That's Hermes, who the Romans then called Mercury. And we have a god of war, Ares, or the Roman name of Mars. And so they found the god who had the similar qualities to the Babylonian ones and then gave them those names. And that seems to be the process by which the Greeks named the planets. Now, when the astrologers, then Hellenistic astrologers, began to develop the astrology, they were very careful in their writings, and that they didn't say Venus represents erotic and love and beauty, but they said the star of Venus. So the Greeks were careful not to identify the planets with the gods themselves, but rather the qualities of the planets, the qualities of planets being under the auspices or umbrella of a certain deity. And they were careful not to mix up that the star or planet was the god itself, but that the qualities of that planet fell under the auspices of a certain deity. So that's how the Greek names entered into the pantheon of planets. And then the Romans, who came after the Greeks, gave the equivalent Latin name. So Hermes became Mercury, Aphrodite became Venus, Ares became Mars, Kronos, who was equivalent to the Babylonian god Ninurta, became Saturn, and a similar process.
Interesting. So there's a really rich history there, a long history as well. And then we've got some little spots there where we don't know exactly what was going on.
Right, at the very beginning. Right. It's like what came first, the chicken or the egg?
Yes, exactly.
We get that far. We don't know. We have some art that gives us tantalizing speculations. We don't have anything written down unless, at least where we're at right now in our developmental level, unless it's written down, we can't say for sure that that's what may have happened.
Right. But I think one thing that you pointed out that we need to take stock of that's important is that the connection to the night sky and the natural world was different, and that there was some kind of process. We can infer that there was some kind of process where the observation and the naming were kind of going hand in hand, possibly, at least,
Well, yes, because the astronomers were also the priests. So it was a religious, spiritual connection. And the pyramid-shaped like buildings called ziggurats in Mesopotamia had 7 levels, which we think were for the 7 planets. And inside were storage areas for the grain. And at the very top were astronomical observatories. So those astronomers would climb up the ladder, so to speak, of each planet to the very top, look up at the sky. And it was a religious experience, that the deity itself, the manifestation of the deity, the visual appearance of the deity would come to them, and they would be in a state of receptivity of what is it trying to tell us that's important for us to know, so we can then give this information to the king, so the king might govern the land in accordance with divine intention. And so that there was this major column of dissent, that the astrology was religious, the planets were the gods, the myths told the stories of the gods and their qualities. It was observational, and that you saw something and you wrote it down so that there was a record. And its purpose was political insofar as the information was used for the supposed well-being of the people of the nation.
So fascinating. Mm-hmm. Okay, so then we fast forward several hundred years and we get to the discovery of the outer planets, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, and the naming of those. Can you tell us a little bit how that's really different and what was going on there?
Well, first of all, we need to be aware that Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto could not have been discovered until the telescope was discovered, because they're not generally visible to the naked eye. And a qualification to this is, if you're ever in a trivia game and you're asked, like, what's the farthest planet that's like not visible? And we all say, oh, Uranus. And it's like, no, wrong. If you know exactly where it is, it could be seen, but generally unless we have a telescope, we can't do that. So there are some contemporary astrologers that complain about the paucity of traditional astrology only using the 7 planets. Like, what's the matter with them that they didn't use the outer planets? Well, the matter was they didn't know they were there, and they couldn't know they were there until they had more technological devices that would help them. Okay, so then they began to be discovered, and it was a very indirect naming process, because when Uranus was discovered, it was discovered by William and Caroline, his sister Herschel. They were brother-sister, a team of astronomers, and Caroline often isn't given credit for that, but she needs to be. And he wanted to name it George after the current king, but it didn't really take. And then it was called Herschel for a while, because it was Herschel who discovered it. And then finally, the name of Uranus was given. And Uranus is a gloss on the Greek god Uranos, which is spelled Uranos. And he was one of the gods at the very beginning of creation, the god of the sky. And it was when Uranos, the heavens or the sky, mated with Gaia, the earth, then that was like one of the beginnings of the generations of all the gods. But he seemed to be, in Greek mythology, he seemed to be a very rigid and power-hungry sort of deity. And as Gaia gave birth to different children that happened from the union of the sky with the earth, Uranus didn't want to let them live, because he was afraid that one of them would grow up and supersede him. And so he kept pushing them back into her belly. And the story was, she became so distended with all of these children that she was conceiving that she couldn't give birth to. And she arranged for one of her youngest sons, Kronos, who we know as Saturn, to take care of the situation, got a sickle and castrated Uranus. And then we have a new generation of gods that arises. And so the associations that we have now with the planet Uranus is revolutionary and rebellious and freedom-loving and innovative, don't exactly correlate to the mythology of the sky god Uranus in the way that that myth has come down to us. And so that there's a little bit of dissonance there. And that was one of the inconsistencies that led Rick Tarnas in the early 80s to publish a monograph proposing that Prometheus, one of the gods who was like rebellious and stole fire from the gods to give to humankind so they could cook their food and stay warm and be civilized, was a more apt archetypal principle for this planet as we started discovering by observation and correlation than Uranus was. But the original naming of Uranus was, well, it was the planet in the solar system after Saturn, and he was the father of Kronos, Saturn. And so it sort of made sense that he would be like the next generation up. So while on a certain level, mythologically, there was a reason for that, observationally, it didn't really pan out, according to many astrologers who look at how the planet Uranus is expressed in a couple hundred years that we've been looking at. Do you have like more to say about that, Tony? I know you've been thinking about Uranus a lot.
I was just right before we started recording, I was telling you, I was thinking about Tarnas's ideas here. And while I don't disagree with them in general, I was thinking about how you teach students how to use myth with astrology and how you encourage students to use all parts of the story. And while Uranus, the figure, was maybe sounds like a little bit more Saturnian in the sense of like controlling and trying to stop things from happening, the story itself contains the idea of revolution and overthrow. And so in that sense, I think the greater, gist of the story does align with the energy of the planet. So I think that's interesting. But how about Neptune and Pluto? Do you feel like those are good fits, and how did those names come about?
Well, okay, we need to roll this back a few steps and just address the situation of planets being given signs that they rule. And before the discovery of Uranus, the planet Saturn ruled both Capricorn and Aquarius. And for those students and people who've studied the thema mundi, we know that there is a geometrical reason for the assignment of planetary rulerships. That concept had not been remembered around the time that Neptune and Pluto were discovered, because it was part of the corpus of Greek texts that were buried and untranslated, and we wouldn't really fully uncover that material for a while yet through translation. But initially, Uranus was given rulership of Capricorn. And I have one textbook written in the mid-1800s that said, Uranus, we're looking at it, we think it rules Capricorn. That's what astrologers are saying. And then at a certain point, no, we're going to give it to Aquarius, because Aquarius is an air sign, and Uranus was the king of the heavens, which is up in the air. So that they were starting to make associations between a planet being like the sign it was said to rule, whereas earlier that determination was based on geometry and the distance of the planets, their speeds from the sun, and so on. So then you get to the discovery of Neptune, and they're looking at, and Neptune, who is Poseidon, was one of the brothers of Jupiter, Zeus. And so Jupiter was the king of the gods, and he had 5 brothers and sisters. And when he became king of the gods, he gave rulership, especially to his 2 brothers. He said to Poseidon, Neptune, you take the seas. And he said to his brother Pluto, you take the underworld. And that's how our three bros are going to divvy up the world. And so there may have been this thought that those three deities who had risen to be the prince, the king and his brothers, so to speak, of their new pantheon, should be acknowledged and honored. And because Neptune was the god of the oceans and the sea, and the sign of Pisces was ruled by Jupiter, as well as Jupiter ruling Sag. Well, Jupiter could sort of like move over, like you don't have to like take the whole piece of pie, like give a little bit up to your brother Poseidon, Neptune. And because that was a water sign, he was god of the oceans, it seemed to make sense to them that that should be Neptune, and Neptune should rule Pisces. And then when Pluto was discovered, Pluto, or Hades, was the youngest of the 6 Olympian deities who were Zeus's, Jupiter's siblings. And Pluto is the god of the underworld. And at this point, Mars ruled both Aries and Scorpio. And because of Scorpio's associations with death and rebirth and the 8th house were fully set into place by the 1930s, they said, oh, yes, Pluto is most like the sign of Scorpio. So that's how that association came into being. And then, okay, they were named, and then subsequently, we began to see trends in society that seemed to mirror the qualities of the god after who the planet was named. So Neptune's discovery was in 1846, 1848. I always get that confused, but you have the birth of cinematography and film happening there, and Neptune is all about the projection of the illusion. You had spiritualism arise as a major new religion that was very popular in the last part of the 1800s into the early 1900s, and the development of revival of occult and metaphysical interests and psychic phenomena. And then with Pluto, they associate with the unleashing of the atomic bomb and the incredible concentration of power that is contained in that planet. And so when those two planets were named, it was given those names, it was not the result of centuries of observation, figuring out what they might be like. They named them in part based on the lines of a mythological pantheon and its hierarchy. And then observationally, either they seem to correlate with their namesake events. And so it was that divinely inspired, was like the pantheon set into place from the very beginning of time, and it was obvious what the planet should be called, or it happened by some connection with a psyche of the collective unconscious. You can get into all kinds of Jungian theories going along with that. Or was it more unsettling that astrologers already had a preconception of the kinds of things that might happen, and that's what they chose to see and identify? So that brings us into all kinds of views about what we're doing with astrology.
Thanks for that. And one of the things to call out for those of you who may just be new to learning about astrology as well is in this history, in our tradition with the visible planets, it's possible that, astrologers were involved in the naming, and because that was just woven into the fabric of what was happening then and who was doing those kind of observations. Whereas by the time we get to Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, astronomers who were disconnected from the practice of astrology were doing the naming. And so what do you think about that piece, that we have astronomers doing the naming, and then it's still possible somehow that the names sync up? Students always kind of get mystified by that.
Right. Well, if you really want to go way out into jumping off the cliff into the abyss on that one. You go right straight into the asteroids. And astronomers are now naming the asteroids. There's like 23,000 asteroids, and whatever astronomer discovers it has the privilege of giving its name. And the first 1,000 asteroids discovered beginning right in 1800, 1801. By the end of the 1800s, so century, there were about 1,000 discovered, and they were primarily given the names of mythic deities from all the different traditions. And most of them happen to be feminine goddess-named deities, the first being Ceres, Pallas, and Juno, which were the three sisters of Jupiter, Neptune, and Pluto. So they also, the first were named after this ranking system, but the others were just named randomly. And then since 1900, there's been another 22,000 that we have names of. And we have software whereby they can be put in the chart. And those names work also with an uncanny kind of correspondence. And so there's asteroids named Demetra and Tony, right? And Tony and I have those asteroids totally prominent, those name asteroids prominent in our own charts and through synastry between the two of our charts that shows, our connection as friends and our professional relationship. Once you get into that, you'll see the names of your partners and your parents and children show up with uncanny accuracy in your chart, as well as the whole pantheon of mythic names and also historical names. And so from that perspective, that's clearly not a matter of observation and correlation, and brings us into a really mystical dimension of how astrology works, that astronomer who doesn't know anything about astrology, or if they do, they're unlikely to believe it at all, and that they may have not had any training in the collective unconscious and Jungian theories, but just like off the top, giving it its name, that one could say that they are tuning into some sort of larger, greater wisdom that permeates our solar system, that permeates our universe, and that it works. One of my own stories is after my first child was born, I couldn't think of a name for him for a week. We kept trying out different names, and it was no. And then someone came along with the name of Daniel, and we heard and we said, oh yeah, like that's his name. Like it was clear as bell. And then it was 15 or 20 years later that there was an asteroid Daniel for which I got an ephemeris for, or we could find where it was in his chart. And it was right on his ascendant when he was born. So like, how does that kind of stuff happen?
That's just crazy. Yeah.
Right. That's crazy. Yeah.
And inspiring. And
so part of it is very scientific, and part of it is just making that connection to a spiritual cohesion that exists between individuals, the sky, and some sort of higher wisdom, divine mind, creative intelligence that encompasses all of us, that and through that we read charts.
Beautiful. Well, that's a great place to end for today. And I hope you've been inspired by the conversation, which, although maybe it didn't give hard and fast answers to everything, definitely gives us a lot of food for thought and for reflection. So thanks for that, Demetra. As always, so good to see you.
Likewise.
And thanks, friends, for tuning into this conversation. And until next time, take good care.